Hi YouTube, my name is Jack. It is Pride Month, so let's talk about some queer shit. Specifically, the thing that I would like to talk about today is gender as it relates to deity, and then more specifically, because I'm me, because this is what I talk about, as it relates to the gods of Wicca. There is a narrative that became popular in the back half of the 20th century and probably really reached its height in the 90s. That the idea of Wicca, that the core theological idea of Wicca, was the balance of the divine feminine and the divine masculine. That the purpose of Wicca was to honor sexual dimorphism in nature by expressing deity through a goddess and a god, and that there was something very important about balancing the two of them. Such that kind of the idea of the goddess was really just that you wanted someone female, and you could kind of slot in any goddess you wanted as long as you had a goddess who was ladylike. And then conversely, for the god, you could kind of slot in any god who was male, and the point was more the having of two deities of different genders, and that was kind of the heart of what it was really all about. This is a narrative that you see more so in, like, the Wicca that's getting published in books, particularly kind of the solitary eclectic version of Wicca. It never took as much root in traditional Wiccan spaces for a couple of reasons, but hi sweetie, there certainly was an idea, and you still see Wicca talked about in this way, both by people who are practitioners, but more often by people who are not practitioners, who are expressing things about Wicca that don't resonate with them. And a thing that is very common for people to talk about is this idea that Wicca kind of just wants a boy and a girl, and it doesn't really matter who they are, and you just kind of pick one of each, such that, you know, your goddess and your god might be, whatever, Sekhmet and Angus MacOg, and they don't really go together, they're not from the same pantheons, but the idea, sweetie, no, don't do that. She's not going to listen to me. She's going to go right back to it. Excuse me just a second. Take two. There was sort of this idea that the only thing that really mattered about deities in a Wiccan context was that one of them be female and one of them be male, because they were expressions of these ideas of the divine feminine and the divine masculine. And then those ideas themselves came loaded with a great number of preconceptions about what exactly constituted feminine and masculine. So the divine feminine was cyclical and intuitive and emotional and nurturing, and the divine masculine was linear and rational and aggressive and so on. And right, these were very specific culturally constructed notions of masculinity and femininity, but they kind of got built into this idea that the purpose of Wicca was to have a goddess who embodied the divine feminine and a god who embodied the divine masculine. And let's problematize that a little bit. Let's talk critically about it. If that is how you relate to the gods, if your experience of deity is the divine feminine and the divine masculine, I really don't mean to denigrate or dismiss that, right? I think it is a legitimate way of experiencing the divine, but it is not how I experience the divine, and it's really not how I experience specifically the gods of Wicca. Right, so for anyone who is unfamiliar with me on this channel, I am a Gardnerian Wiccan. I belong to sort of a portion of the traditional Wiccan community that really sees what we do as the priesthood of two particular deities, who are the patron deities of the craft. So we have a goddess, but she's not just any goddess, she is a very specific goddess who has particular features. I talk about those features a lot in this book, Queen of All Witcheries, which is currently out of print, but you can still find used copies lying around. I think it's a very good book. We have a goddess, we have a god who is not just any god, he is a very specific god with specific features. And to me, my experience, my understanding of those gods is that they're not gods of gender. They're not about gender. I experience them as deities who have gender, right? The goddess is a goddess. She is feminine. Her pronouns are she, her. The god is a god. He is masculine. His pronouns are he, him. But those are not the things that they're the gods of, in my personal experience, in the way that I relate to these deities. To me, the goddess is much more a goddess of the moon and the earth and life and magic and love. Those are the things that she's the goddess of. And she's not, like, the fact that she's feminine is a feature of her that we can use to describe her, but it's not a really deeply important and essential. Well, I want to walk that language back a little bit. I feel that you can adequately understand the goddess as I understand her without placing great emphasis on her gender. Her gender is not one of the most interesting things about her. And the same is true for the god, right? I don't know, right? I think there's a sense in which when people talk about the divine feminine, the divine masculine, they're kind of saying that these are gods of gender, right? The divine feminine is the goddess of femininity. And that's not what I experience the Wiccan goddess as being a goddess of, right? I experience her as being a goddess of the moon, the earth, witchcraft, magic, love, cyclicality, life, whatever other thing you want to put on it, but not femininity. In the same way that, like, oh gosh, I don't know. In the same way that Athena is a goddess of war and strategy and philosophy and art and craftsmanship, she is also a goddess who has gray eyes. That is a thing about her. That is how she is routinely described in Homer. But she is not the goddess of gray eyes. That is an adjective that describes her. It is a feature of who she is, but it's not what she's all about. So to me, gender with the Wiccan gods accurately describes things about them. She is a goddess, he is a god. But it's not what they're all about. It's a descriptive feature of them. The same way that all of us have descriptive features that are not the essence of who we are. And I mean, that's complicated because, right, the goddess is, among other things, a goddess of motherhood. Motherhood very closely linked in with notions of femininity. So, like, it gets murky. And I don't really mean to say that, like, you could gender swap the gods and they would be the exact same, because I don't think that they would. All right, I think that if the goddess were a god instead of a goddess, and if the god were a goddess instead of a god, there is something about them that would be materially different. But at the same time, like, I think that, okay, if you have the goddess of the Wicca as she is generally known, the god of the Wicca as he is generally known, now gender swap them so you have the god who would be equivalent to that goddess, and you have the goddess who would be equivalent to that god. I think that this god who is everything about the goddess except gender swapped, has more in common with the goddess of the Wicca than he does with the god of the Wicca. And this goddess, who is everything about the god except gender swapped, has more in common with the god of the Wicca than with the goddess of the Wicca. So, like, if you changed only the gender of the gods, I think you would still have figures who are closer to their originals than to their gendered counterparts within a Wiccan framework. And all of this, like everything that I'm circling around, that I'm trying to say, could be put much more succinctly. There's a shocker for you, Jack Chanik, not speaking succinctly. Could be much more succinct by saying, I understand our gods as gods who have gender, not as gods of gender. And there are Wiccans who don't experience that the same way, right? There are Wiccans for whom the idea of the divine feminine, the divine masculine, very, very important. It's not for me, but it is on the table. It is a legitimate way of approaching and interacting with those gods. Conversely, there are Wiccans for whom gender is just not even a part of it. Again, not for me. Like, I do think that if you took the goddess and changed her gender, you would no longer have the same deity. Gender is a part of who these gods are. I just don't think it's the defining thing that's like the reason that we worship them, or rather the reason that I worship them. But there certainly are Wiccans who just don't conceive of the gods in gendered terms. And that's a bit far afield from my experience. I don't have the ability to elaborate much on that in a way that would be a faithful representation of other people's experiences. But people have reported that to me, and I have no reason to believe that they are lying about how they experience the gods, right? Wicca is experiential, Wicca is complicated. People have very different experiences of the gods. So, all of this to say, gender is just weird and messy and complicated. And that's true for humans, it's also true for the gods. So, yeah, I don't know. I think the point that I'm trying to make is that it's sometimes fashionable to talk about Wicca in these really rigidly gendered terms as being all about the divine feminine and the divine masculine. And certainly there are people now, and there have been people in the past, who approached Wicca in that way. Again, I think this really reached its height in the 90s. But I also think that that's not true to my experience of the craft. It's not true to the experience of the craft of a lot of other people that I know and interact with in the community. And to me, like, yes, the gods have gender, but so do I. And I'm not the witch masculine. I'm a witch who happens to be a man. And that's kind of how I feel about the gods. So I'll wrap this up here. Thank you for watching. Happy Pride Month. And I'll talk to you soon. Bye.